In the summer of 1989, PepsiCo, a soft drink company headquartered in Purchase, New York, became, for a brief and almost unbelievable window of time, the sixth largest military power on planet Earth. I want you to sit with that sentence for a second. Because it sounds like fiction. It sounds like the kind of thing you'd see in a satire, or a punchline in an economics lecture. But it happened. A company that sold sugar water to teenagers in Ohio and Texas found itself, on paper, in possession of 17 submarines, a cruiser, a destroyer, a frigate, an entire naval fleet decommissioned from the Soviet Union, sitting under the ownership of the same corporation that made Mountain Dew. How does that happen? It happens because of money, or more precisely, because of the absence of money, real money, the kind that crosses borders and means something on the other side. See, in 1989, the Soviet Union had a currency, the ruble, that was, for all practical purposes, worthless outside its own borders. You couldn't take a stack of Soviet rubles to a bank in London or Zurich and exchange them for dollars. No one wanted them. The ruble was a closed loop, trapped inside an economy that was quietly collapsing under its own weight. And PepsiCo had a problem. They'd spent nearly 2 decades building an empire inside the USSR, the first American consumer product ever sold behind the Iron Curtain. And now the Soviets owed them in a currency that was functionally monopoly money on the world stage. So what do you do when your trading partner's cash is worthless, but they've got something else lying around? Something with real value, sitting in a shipyard? You take the ships. This is not a story about a soda, not really. This is a story about what happens when a corporation gets pulled into the machinery of a collapsing empire, when the normal rules of business stop applying, and a company man from Purchase, New York finds himself negotiating not in dollars, but in warships, vodka, and geopolitics. And it starts, like a lot of Cold War stories do, in a kitchen. To understand how a beverage company ends up owning a navy, you have to go back to 1959, to Moscow, to an exhibition hall, and a man named Donald Kendall. Kendall wasn't some visionary at this point, not yet. He was a Pepsi executive, ambitious, restless, the kind of man who understood that being second to Coca-Cola in America meant you had to find territory Coke hadn't claimed yet. And in 1959, at the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to hold dueling exhibitions, each showing off the fruits of their economic system to the other side's public. The American National Exhibition landed in Moscow's Sokolniki Park, and Pepsi, through Kendall's sheer force of will, secured a booth. Here's the detail most people don't know. Kendall almost didn't get Nikita Khrushchev to the booth at all. Vice President Richard Nixon was touring the exhibition with Khrushchev, and the two of them stopped, famously, in a mock American kitchen, the moment history now calls the kitchen debate, where Nixon and Khrushchev argued, jabbing fingers at each other, about capitalism versus communism, dishwashers versus 5-year plans. Kendall saw his opening. He pulled Nixon aside. The two men knew each other. Nixon had done legal work for Pepsi, and asked him to steer Khrushchev toward the Pepsi booth. Nixon did. And there it is, in a photograph that would circulate around the world, Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, holding a paper cup of Pepsi, apparently enjoying it, surrounded by cameras. That photograph was worth more than any ad campaign Pepsi could have bought. It was proof, visual and undeniable, that even the enemy liked the taste of American capitalism. Kendall understood, instantly, what he was holding. This wasn't just good press. It was the beginning of a relationship that most other American executives wouldn't dare pursue for another 13 years. Kendall became CEO of PepsiCo in 1963, and he never let go of the idea that the USSR, this enormous, closed, forbidden market of over 240 million people, was Pepsi's ticket to doing something Coca-Cola couldn't touch. It took over a decade of patient, quiet diplomacy. Kendall cultivated relationships in Washington and in Moscow simultaneously, threading a needle that most CEOs wouldn't have had the patience or the political instincts for. And in 1972, it paid off. PepsiCo signed a landmark deal, becoming the first American company permitted to sell a consumer product inside the Soviet Union. But here's the catch, and it's the catch that defines this entire story. The Soviets weren't going to pay in dollars. They couldn't. The ruble was non-convertible. It had no value on international currency markets. So Kendall and PepsiCo agreed to something almost unheard of in American business, a barter deal. PepsiCo would ship its syrup and build bottling plants inside the USSR. In exchange, they'd take payment in the one Soviet export that did have value on Western shelves, Stolichnaya vodka. PepsiCo became the exclusive U.S. importer of Stoli, selling it in American liquor stores to generate real dollars, which they then used to fund the Soviet operation. It was elegant in its way. A closed loop that let two economic systems, fundamentally incompatible, actually trade with each other. And it worked. By the 1980s, Pepsi was everywhere in the Soviet Union, bottling plants humming in cities across the USSR, Soviet citizens drinking more Pepsi per year than some American states. It was, by every measure, one of the greatest single-market penetrations in the history of consumer goods. Kendall had built something no other Western executive had managed, a beachhead inside the Forbidden Empire. This was the Golden Age. Pepsi wasn't just a product behind the Iron Curtain. It was, in a strange way, a symbol. A little taste of the outside world, bottled and sold under state supervision, tolerated by a government that officially despised everything it represented. But empires built on barter systems are fragile, and by the late 1980s, the empire underneath Pepsi's Soviet operation was coming apart. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost, perestroika, were supposed to modernize the Soviet economy. Instead, they exposed just how hollow it had become. Inflation climbed, production stalled, and the ruble, already worthless internationally, became almost meaningless domestically too. By 1989, the Soviet Union's ability to pay its Western partners in anything resembling hard currency had essentially collapsed. Pepsi had a genuine, serious problem. They'd expanded their Soviet operation for nearly 2 decades on the promise of the vodka barter arrangement, but that system was straining under its own volume. There's only so much Stolichnaya an American public will drink. Pepsi needed to expand its Soviet bottling operations further, and Moscow needed more Pepsi plants, more Western consumer goods, but there was, quite simply, no money to make the deal work in any conventional sense. So in April 1989, Donald Kendall sat down again, this time not with a paper cup and a photographer, but with Soviet officials negotiating the largest deal of his career. PepsiCo agreed to a staggering $3 billion 10-year expansion, more bottling plants, more Pepsi, across more of the USSR. And in exchange, for part of the payment, the Soviet Union offered PepsiCo something it had never offered anyone: warships. Not new ones, not weapons of active military value. The Soviet Navy was decommissioning a batch of aging vessels, 17 diesel-powered submarines, a cruiser, a destroyer, a frigate, and PepsiCo, structuring the deal through a Norwegian shipping and scrapping company, agreed to take them as partial payment, intending to sell them for scrap metal value. I need you to understand how strange this genuinely was, even to the people living through it. Donald Kendall reportedly turned to a U.S. National Security Council official around this time and joked, "We are disarming the Soviet Union faster than you." It's the kind of line that sounds too clean to be true, the kind of quote that gets repeated so often in business folklore you start to wonder if it's apocryphal. But whether Kendall said it with that exact phrasing or not, the underlying fact isn't folklore. The paperwork is real. The scrapping contracts are real. For a period of time, PepsiCo's balance sheet technically included a naval fleet. This is the moment the story stops being about soda and starts being about something bigger. About what happens when a private corporation gets so deeply embedded inside a nation's economy that it becomes a participant in that nation's decline. Pepsi wasn't just selling a beverage anymore. It was functioning as an accidental arm of Cold War currency arbitrage, converting decommissioned Soviet military hardware into scrap steel, into dollars, into more syrup contracts. And it should tell you something about the fragility of the entire Soviet system that this was considered a reasonable business solution. When a superpower's navy is worth more to a soda company as scrap metal than the superpower's own currency is worth on paper, that's not a footnote. That's a diagnosis. 2 years later, in December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. 15 new nations emerged from the wreckage, each with its own fledgling, unstable currency. Currencies that, in some cases, were even less convertible and more fragile than the ruble had ever been. And Pepsi's carefully built barter empire, the Vodka-for-Syrup pipeline, the Warships-for-Bottling-Plants arrangement, the entire architecture Donald Kendall had spent 30 years constructing, didn't just weaken, it fractured along with the country it depended on. Because here's the tragedy underneath all of this: Pepsi's success in the USSR was never really about the product. It was about Kendall's ability to navigate a broken, non-convertible currency system through sheer improvisation. Vodka, warships, whatever asset with real value happened to be available. That's not a repeatable business strategy. That's crisis management stretched across 2 decades. And when the crisis it was managing, the Soviet Union itself, ceased to exist, so did the framework that made the whole thing function. Worse, Coca-Cola, which had waited on the sidelines for decades, unwilling or unable to strike Kendall's kind of deal, suddenly had a wide-open door. The newly independent former Soviet states were desperate for hard currency investment, desperate for any Western capital willing to come in without the baggage of decades-old barter contracts. Coca-Cola moved in fast, unencumbered, building fresh relationships with 15 new governments instead of one crumbling one. Pepsi, meanwhile, was left holding contracts written for a country that no longer existed, negotiating with new leaders who owed it nothing and remembered nothing of Kendall's 1959 photograph with Khrushchev. By the mid-1990s, Pepsi's once dominant position across the former USSR was eroding market by market. The company that had been first, the company that broke through the Iron Curtain when it was still iron, was losing ground to the company that had simply waited for the wall to fall on its own. Donald Kendall retired from PepsiCo's chairmanship in 1986, before the warship deal even closed, though he remained deeply connected to the Soviet operation as its architect and its public face for years afterward. He'd spend the rest of his life being remembered, in obituaries and business retrospectives, for exactly one thing: the man who traded Pepsi for a navy. Not the decades of patient diplomacy, not the 12 years it took to get Soviet approval in the first place, just the ships. Because that's the part of the story that's too strange to forget. Here's what I keep coming back to when I think about this story. We tend to imagine Cold War history as a contest fought entirely between generals and presidents, missile counts, spy networks, summit meetings. But some of the most revealing moments of that era happened in boardrooms, not war rooms. A currency that couldn't cross a border, a barter system built on vodka, a fleet of submarines converted into scrap steel to keep a syrup contract alive. It tells you something true about economic collapse, something that's echoing right now, in 2026, in the sanctions regimes wrapped around Russia's oil exports and Iran's frozen assets. When a nation's currency stops meaning anything outside its own borders, trade doesn't stop. It just gets stranger. It shifts into oil, into gold, into barter, into whatever hard asset still holds value when the paper doesn't. The mechanics that let Donald Kendall trade cola syrup for a navy in 1989 are, in their bones, the same mechanics driving today's sanctioned economies to pay each other in rubles, rupees, gold bars, and shadow fleets of oil tankers, because when the dollar door closes, something else always has to open. PepsiCo never used those warships. They were sold for scrap through a Norwegian intermediary, quietly, without ceremony, steel repurposed, decommissioned, forgotten by almost everyone except the business historians, who still bring it up as one of the strangest footnotes in Cold War commerce. But the photograph remains. Khrushchev, paper cup in hand, standing next to a Pepsi booth in 1959, The opening move in a 30-year story that ended, improbably, with a soft drink company owning a piece of a collapsing superpower's navy. It's a story about ambition, about what it costs to be first into a forbidden market, and about the strange, brief moment when the line between a corporation and a nation-state blurred so completely that nobody, not Kendall, not the Kremlin, not the accountants trying to book 17 submarines onto a balance sheet, quite knew what to call it anymore. That's the shift. That's the fall. And that's why, decades later, we're still talking about the time Pepsi went to war and won.